July 4, 1946, 5 p.m. Biskupia Gorka, a hill overlooking Gdańsk, Poland. A crowd of several thousand people has gathered in an open field. They're standing in silence, watching as a fleet of open trucks drives toward a row of simple wooden gallows. 4 double gallows. 1 triple gallows in the center. 11 nooses swaying in the wind. On the trucks stand 11 people. Their hands and legs are tied with cords. No hoods, no dignity. Just condemned war criminals about to die in front of thousands of witnesses. Among them is a 22-year-old woman named Elisabeth Becker. In a few minutes, she'll be standing on the tailboard of a truck with a noose around her neck. The truck will drive forward. She'll drop. The rope will tighten, and she'll strangle to death while thousands watch. Her neck might break if she's lucky. If not, she'll kick and struggle and slowly suffocate. And I'm warning you now. The story of Elisabeth Becker, what she did in just 4 months at Stutthof concentration camp, how she tried to escape justice, and why she was executed in one of the most brutal public hangings of the post-war trials, will make you understand why some crimes demand the ultimate punishment. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell, because we're about to uncover the brutal reality of a woman who selected at least 30 people for the gas chambers, who beat children with a dog whip, who fled her crimes and then begged for mercy, and who died publicly on a gallows hill as thousands cheered. This is the story of Elisabeth Becker. July 20th, 1923. Nootijk, Free City of Danzig. Today it's called Noose, Poland. But in 1923, it was a German territory carved out of Polish land after World War I. Elisabeth Becker was born into a German family. We don't know much about her early childhood. No records of her parents. No stories of trauma or abuse. No obvious signs of what she would become. She was by all accounts an ordinary German girl growing up in an ordinary German town. In 1936, at age 13, Elisabeth joined the League of German Girls, the Bund Deutscher Mädel, or BDM. This was the female counterpart to the Hitler Youth. It was designed to indoctrinate young women into Nazi ideals, to teach them racial purity, obedience to the Führer, physical fitness, and preparation for motherhood. Elisabeth attended meetings. She sang Nazi songs. She learned about the superiority of the Aryan race. She absorbed the ideology. She was 13 years old. 2 years later, in 1938, at age 15, Elisabeth moved to the nearby city of Danzig and got a job as a cook. It was honest work, low-paying, unglamorous, but respectable. She cooked meals. She cleaned kitchens. She lived a normal working-class life. Then came September 1st, 1939. Germany invaded Poland. World War II began. Within days, German forces captured Danzig. The city, which had been a free city under League of Nations protection, was annexed into the Third Reich. For ethnic Germans like Elisabeth, this was liberation. The Nazis had come to protect them, to incorporate them into Greater Germany, to fulfill Hitler's promise of Lebensraum, living space for the German people. Elisabeth adapted successfully, according to records. She didn't resist the occupation, she embraced it. In 1940, at age 17, she left her cooking job and began working for the Dockendorf firm in Nootijk. She worked there for about a year. Then in 1941, she moved back to Danzig and became an agricultural assistant. She worked in farming, supporting the German war effort, growing food for soldiers, contributing to the Nazi economy. She was 18 years old, just another young German woman, doing her part for the fatherland. For the next 3 years, Elisabeth lived this quiet life. Agriculture work, normal routine, no violence, no cruelty, no obvious signs of what she was capable of. And then came 1944. By 1944, Germany was losing the war. Allied forces had landed in Normandy. Soviet forces were pushing from the east. The concentration camp system was expanding rapidly as the Nazis tried to extract every ounce of labor from their prisoners before the inevitable collapse. They needed more guards. In summer 1944, the SS began calling up women from local communities near the camps. They particularly sought women who had proven their loyalty to the Nazi party, women who had been in the BDM, women who could be trusted. Elisabeth Becker received her call-up notice. She was being conscripted to serve as a guard at Stutthof concentration camp, about 35 kilometers east of Danzig. She could have refused. There's no evidence that any woman was ever punished for refusing to serve as a concentration camp guard. She could have said no. She could have claimed illness. She could have found another job supporting the war effort. But she didn't refuse. She accepted the assignment. On September 5, 1944, 21-year-old Elisabeth Becker arrived at Stutthof to begin training as an SS Aufseherin, a female overseer. Stutthof was one of the first concentration camps established by the Nazis outside Germany. It opened in September 1939, just days after the invasion of Poland. By 1944, it held tens of thousands of prisoners. Poles, Jews, Soviet prisoners of war, political prisoners, Roma. The camp had evolved from a labor camp into something worse. In 1944, Stutthof had gas chambers. It had crematoria. It was killing people systematically. Approximately 110,000 people passed through Stutthof during its operation. An estimated 65,000 were murdered, gassed, hanged, shot, worked to death, starved, beaten, or killed by disease and neglect. This was the place Elisabeth Becker volunteered to work. Her training was brief, a few weeks at most. She learned the camp rules, the hierarchy, the procedures. She was issued a uniform, a whip, and authority over human lives. Then she was assigned to SK3, the women's section of Stutthof. Her job was simple: supervise female prisoners, conduct roll calls, maintain order, and select prisoners who were too weak, too sick, or too old to work. Those selections were death sentences. Prisoners selected as unfit for work were sent to the gas chambers. Elisabeth knew this. Everyone knew this. The guards talked about it. The prisoners knew it. The smell from the crematoria filled the air. There was no plausible deniability. Elisabeth's job was to look at women and children and decide who lived and who died. And she did it. Survivor testimony from the trial describes Elisabeth as a woman without a soul or heart. They said she was cruel and heartless. They described her walking through the barracks during roll call with a dog whip in her hand. When prisoners moved too slowly or couldn't stand up straight because they were starving or sick, Elisabeth beat them. She used the whip on women, on children. She struck them across the face, the back, the legs. She kicked them when they fell. She screamed at them to get up. And when they couldn't, she selected them for the gas chambers. One survivor later testified that Elisabeth beat a child so severely with her whip that the child's skin split open. The child was maybe 10 years old. Another witness described roll calls where Elisabeth walked up and down the lines, examining prisoners like livestock. She'd stop in front of a woman, look her up and down and point. "You, out." That prisoner would step out of line. She knew what it meant. The gas chambers. Within hours she'd be dead. During her 4 months at Stutthof, from September 1944 to January 1945, Elisabeth Becker personally selected at least 30 women and children to be gassed. At least 30 that we know of. That's from her own confession during interrogation. She admitted it. She said she selected prisoners who were unfit for work. She said she was following orders. She said she didn't know they would be gassed. That last claim was a lie. During her trial, when pressed by prosecutors, she retracted this. She admitted that yes, she knew. Everyone knew. The selections were for the gas chambers. She had sent at least 30 people to their deaths, but 30 was likely an undercount. Survivors testified that selections happened frequently, sometimes daily, sometimes multiple times per week. Elisabeth worked at Stutthof for 4 months. If she conducted even one selection per week, that's 16 to 20 selections. If each selection involved choosing 5 to 10 prisoners, that's 80 to 200 people. We'll never know the exact number. Most of the camp records were destroyed. Most of the victims were never individually documented. They were just numbers, bodies, smoke from the crematorium. But here's what we do know. Elisabeth Becker wasn't just following orders. She enjoyed the power. Survivors described her as eager, enthusiastic. She volunteered for selections. She walked through the barracks looking for prisoners to condemn. She beat women who begged for mercy. She selected children who cried for their mothers. This wasn't reluctant obedience. This was active participation. Then came January 15th, 1945. Soviet forces were advancing toward Danzig. The Red Army was liberating concentration camps. As they pushed west, the SS began evacuating Stutthof. Prisoners were forced on death marches. Guards were ordered to destroy evidence and retreat. Elisabeth Becker made a decision. She fled. She didn't wait for orders. She didn't try to help prisoners. She just ran. She took off her SS uniform, put on civilian clothes, and went home to Neuteich. She was 21 years old. She'd worked at Stutthof for exactly 4 months, from September 5, 1944 to January 15, 1945. 4 months during which she'd selected at least 30 people for death, beaten countless others, and helped operate one of the Holocaust's killing centers. And now she was home, safe, anonymous, hoping no one would ever find out what she'd done. For 3 months, Elisabeth hid in Neuteich. Germany was collapsing. The war was ending. Allied forces were closing in from all sides. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Soviet forces occupied Eastern Germany and Poland. They began hunting for Nazi war criminals. On April 13, 1945, 1 month before the German surrender, Polish police arrested Elisabeth Becker. Someone had identified her. Maybe a survivor. Maybe a neighbor who knew where she'd worked. Maybe she'd been on a list of SS personnel. However it happened, they found her. She was 21 years old, and she was going to stand trial for war crimes. Elisabeth was taken to prison in Gdansk to await trial. According to some accounts, while in custody, she flirted with her Polish guards. She tried to charm them, to make them like her. She was young after all, pretty, just a girl. Surely they could show some mercy. The guards were not amused. On April 25, 1946, the first Stutthof trial began in Gdansk, before the Polish Special Law Court. This was one of the earliest Nazi war crimes trials, happening concurrently with the more famous Nuremberg trials. 13 defendants were arraigned. The commandant of Stutthof, Johann Pauls, 5 female SS guards, Jenny Wanda Barkman, Elisabeth Becker, Wanda Klaff, Ewa Paradis, and Gerda Steinhoff, 1 female prisoner functionary, Erna Beilhardt, who had served as a capo, and 5 male capos, prisoner functionaries who had brutalized other inmates. The trial lasted just over a month. From April 25 to May 31, 1946, prosecutors presented evidence, camp records, documents, photographs of the gas chambers, the crematoria, the mass graves. Then they called survivors. One by one, former prisoners took the stand. They identified the defendants. They described what they had witnessed. They pointed at Elisabeth Becker and said, "She beat me with a whip. She selected my mother for the gas chamber. She kicked my sister until she couldn't stand. She chose my daughter." Some witnesses broke down, crying on the stand. Others spoke with cold, controlled rage. They wanted justice. They wanted the world to know what had been done to them. Elisabeth and the other defendants sat in the courtroom listening. According to trial observers, the female guards didn't take the proceedings seriously at first. Jenny Barkman, the 24-year-old guard nicknamed the Beautiful Spectre, wore a different hairstyle every day. She flirted with male guards. She giggled during testimony. Gerda Steinhoff, one of the senior female guards, appeared bored. Elisabeth sat quietly. She didn't react much. She probably still believed she'd get away with it, that she'd receive a light sentence, that being young and female would save her. During the trial, Elisabeth was questioned about the selections, about the gas chambers, about the beatings. Initially, she denied everything. She said she never selected anyone for death. She said she never knew people were being gassed. She said she was just doing her job, maintaining order, following orders. But under questioning, facing witness after witness, confronted with evidence, she changed her story. She admitted that yes, she had selected prisoners. At least 30 women and children. She admitted she knew they were being sent to the gas chambers. But she said she had no choice. She said if she refused, she would have been punished, maybe even killed. This was the standard defense. I was just following orders. I had no choice. I would have been shot if I refused. But prosecutors demolished this argument. They presented evidence that no SS guard, male or female, had ever been executed for refusing to participate in killings. Guards who objected were reassigned, transferred, sent to other duties, but not killed. The superior orders defense had already been rejected at Nuremberg. The principle was clear. Following orders is not a defense for war crimes. You have a moral duty to refuse illegal orders. Elisabeth Becker had a choice. She chose to select prisoners for death. She chose to beat them. She chose to participate in mass murder. The prosecution also addressed the argument that the female guards were less culpable than male guards because they held lower ranks and less power. But survivor testimony made clear that female guards were often more brutal than their male counterparts. They had direct daily contact with prisoners. They conducted the selections. They administered the beatings. They inflicted psychological torture. They were essential to the camp's operation. On May 31, 1946, the verdict came down. All 13 defendants were found guilty of war crimes. 11 were sentenced to death. Johann Pauls, the commandant, the 5 female SS guards, Barkman, Becker, Klaff, Paradis, and Steinhoff, and 5 male capos. 2 defendants received prison sentences. Erna Beilhardt, the female capo, got 5 years. 1 male capo got 3 years. When Elisabeth Becker heard her sentence, death by hanging, she finally understood. This was real. She was going to die. She was 22 years old. She'd worked at Stutthof for 4 months, and now she was condemned to death. Immediately she began writing letters to the Polish president, Elisabeth Becker, begging for clemency. She wrote that her actions had not been as severe as those of Gerda Steinhoff or Jenny Barkman. She wrote that she'd been at the camp for the shortest amount of time, just 4 months. She wrote that she'd been young, naive, following orders. She wrote multiple letters, pleading, desperate. And here's the remarkable thing. The court itself recommended that her sentence be commuted. The judges suggested that Elisabeth should serve 15 years in prison instead of being executed. They acknowledged that her crimes, while serious, were less severe than some of the other defendants. Gerda Steinhoff had been at Stutthof longer and had selected far more prisoners. Jenny Bachmann was notorious for extreme cruelty. Elisabeth had been there only 4 months. She was the youngest defendant. Surely 15 years in prison was sufficient punishment. The recommendation went to President Bolslav Bierut. He reviewed the case, he read Elisabeth's letters, he considered the court's recommendation, and he said no. No pardon, no commutation. Death sentence stands. Why? Because Elisabeth Becker had confessed to selecting at least 30 people for the gas chambers. She had beaten children with a whip. She had participated in genocide. 4 months was enough time to commit crimes worthy of death. Being young was no excuse. Following orders was no excuse. She would hang. The execution date was set for July 4, 1946. Just over a month after the verdict. The location, Biskupia Gorka, a hill near Gdansk. The method, public hanging by short drop. Not the humane long drop used by professional executioners like Albert Pierrepoint, which breaks the neck and causes instant unconsciousness, but the short drop method, a simple noose, a short fall, death by strangulation, slow, painful, public, July 4, 1946. The 11 condemned prisoners were held in cells near the execution site. Throughout the day they were prepared. Their identities were confirmed. They were given time to write final letters if they wished. Some did, some didn't. By early evening, around 5 p.m., it was time. The execution site had been prepared in an open area on Biskupia Gorka hill. A row of simple wooden gallows had been erected. 4 double gallows and 1 triple gallows in the center. 11 nooses total. The gallows were crude, just wooden beams. No trapdoors. No mechanism for a proper drop. Just simple nooses hanging from crossbeams. The execution method was brutal in its simplicity. The condemned would be placed standing on the tailboards of trucks or on chairs. Nooses would be placed around their necks. Then the trucks would drive forward or the chairs would be kicked away. The prisoners would drop a short distance and hang. If they were lucky, the drop and sudden tension might break their necks, causing near-instant unconsciousness. If they were unlucky, they would strangle slowly, kicking and struggling as they suffocated. Several thousand people had gathered to watch. Some were survivors of Stutthof. Some were Polish citizens who had suffered under Nazi occupation. Some were just spectators, curious to see justice carried out. Some brought children. It was a public event, justice being seen to be done. At 5 p.m. the trucks arrived carrying the condemned. Their hands were tied behind their backs. Their legs were bound with cords. They wore simple prison clothes. No hoods. Their faces were visible. The crowd could see them. Photographers were present, documenting everything. Official press photographers. This execution would be recorded. The images would be distributed worldwide. Evidence that Nazi war criminals were being held accountable. The condemned were positioned at their respective gallows. Johann Pauls, the commandant, was placed at the central triple gallows. The 5 female guards were positioned along the row. Jenny Bachmann was at one end. She was fashionably dressed, even for her execution. Her hair was styled. Witnesses later said she looked composed, almost defiant. Next to her was Ewa Paradis, then Elisabeth Becker, then Wanda Clough, then Gerda Steinhoff. The 5 male capos were positioned along the other gallows. Executioners moved along the row, placing nooses around each neck. Simple cord nooses, no hoods, no blindfolds. The condemned could see everything. The crowd, the other prisoners waiting to die, the executioners working methodically, moving from one prisoner to the next. Some of the condemned stood calmly, accepting their fate. Others struggled. According to witness accounts, 1 man and 2 women fought with the guards before being subdued. Most accepted it. What choice did they have? Elisabeth Becker stood on the tailboard of a truck. She was 22 years old. Less than 2 years ago, she'd been working in agriculture in Newtyke. Now she had a noose around her neck. She could see the crowd. Thousands of people watching her die. Some were shouting, cursing her, calling her a murderer. She could see the other condemned prisoners. Jenny Bachmann stood a few meters away, still composed. Gerda Steinhoff was nearby. They were all about to die together. The executioners finished their preparations. They stepped back. They gave the signal. The trucks began to move forward. The chairs were kicked away. 11 people dropped simultaneously. The ropes snapped taut. Bodies jerked. Some necks broke immediately. Those prisoners went limp, unconscious, dead within seconds. Others weren't so lucky. Historical photographs show Jenny Bachmann still struggling several seconds after the drop. Her body twisting, her face contorted. She was still alive, still conscious, strangling. Next to her, Ewa Paradis was in the same position. Still fighting, still dying. Elisabeth Becker's execution appears to have been quicker. From the photographic evidence, it seems her neck broke on the drop. She would have been rendered unconscious almost immediately. Still a brutal death, but mercifully swift compared to some of the others. The crowd watched in silence at first. Then, as the bodies stopped struggling, as death took hold, some began to cheer. Justice, revenge, closure. The bodies were left hanging for a period of time, to ensure death, to let the crowd see. Then they were cut down. According to records, the bodies of the executed individuals were taken to the medical university in Gdansk. An anatomy professor stated they were used for dissection by medical students. After the dissections were complete, they were disposed of as medical waste. No burial, no grave, no marker, just medical waste. Elisabeth Becker's body was cut up by students learning anatomy, then thrown away. She was 22 years old. And here's what makes Elisabeth Becker's story so disturbing. Not just what she did, but how ordinary she was. She wasn't a monster from birth. She wasn't a sadistic psychopath. She was a normal German girl who joined the League of German Girls at 13, worked as a cook and agricultural assistant, and then, when given the opportunity, became a mass murderer. 4 months. That's all it took. From September 5, 1944 to January 15, 1945. In 4 months, Elisabeth transformed from a civilian into someone who could select children for gas chambers, who could beat prisoners with a whip, who could look a terrified woman in the eye and point her toward death. What does that tell us about human nature? What does it tell us about the capacity for evil that exists in ordinary people? Hannah Arendt wrote about the banality of evil, the idea that genocide isn't carried out by monsters but by normal people who make choices, who follow orders, who compartmentalize, who tell themselves they're just doing their job. Elisabeth Becker is a textbook example. She didn't seek out the position. She was conscripted, but she didn't refuse. And once she had the power, she used it. Enthusiastically, she didn't just follow orders. She volunteered for selections. She beat prisoners who didn't need to be beaten. She went beyond what was required. She found something in that power, some satisfaction, some sense of purpose or importance. And it cost at least 30 lives. At least 30 women and children gasped because Elisabeth Becker pointed at them. Countless others beaten, traumatized, dehumanized because she had a whip and the authority to use it. Now some people argue that Elisabeth's execution was unjust, that she was too young, that 4 months wasn't long enough to warrant death, that she was following orders, that the real criminals were the Nazi leadership, not low-level guards. These arguments have some merit. Elisabeth was young. She was low-ranking. She served for a relatively short time. The major architects of the Holocaust, Hitler, Himmler, Heydrich, they bore greater responsibility. But here's the counter-argument. Elisabeth Becker had agency. She made choices. She could have refused the position. She could have requested a transfer. She could have performed her duties with minimal cruelty. Instead, she embraced the role. She selected prisoners eagerly. She beat them brutally. She participated actively in genocide. And when the war ended, she fled. She hid. She showed no remorse until she was caught and tried. Even during the trial, she lied. She denied her crimes until confronted with evidence. She only admitted to selections when she had no choice. And then she begged for mercy. The mercy she never showed to her victims. The court recommended commutation. They were willing to show her the leniency she never showed others. But President Beirut said no. And he was right. Elisabeth Becker selected at least 30 people for death. She beat children. She traumatized hundreds. 4 months was enough time to commit crimes worthy of execution. Being young is not an excuse for genocide. Following orders is not an excuse for murder. She deserved to hang. And she did. But here's what's truly chilling. Elisabeth Becker was one of thousands of women who served as concentration camp guards. Approximately 3,700 women worked in the Nazi camp system. Most were never prosecuted. Most went home after the war, changed their names, resumed normal lives. The Stutthof trial prosecuted 5 female guards out of dozens who worked there. The women executed on July 4, 1946 were the exception, not the rule. Most female guards escaped justice entirely. They lived full lives. They had families. They grew old. They died peacefully in their beds. Elisabeth Becker was unlucky. She was caught. She was tried. She was convicted. And she was executed in one of the most brutal public displays of post-war justice. But what about the others? What about the guards who worked at Stutthof for years instead of months? What about the ones who selected hundreds instead of 30? What about the ones who got away? We'll never know their names. We'll never know what they did after the war, whether they felt guilt, whether they told their children, whether they ever looked at their grandchildren and thought about the children they'd sent to gas chambers. Elisabeth Becker died at 22. She never got the chance to grow old, to have a family, to live a normal life, and that's exactly what she deserved, because the 30 people she selected never got those chances either. The children she beat with a whip never grew up. The women she sent to the gas chambers never went home. They died because Elisabeth Becker pointed at them. They died because a 21-year-old German girl decided that her obedience to orders was more important than their lives. The public hanging on Biskupia Gorka hill was brutal. It was meant to be. It was justice, crude and unforgiving. It was a message. This is what happens to people who commit genocide. This is what happens to people who select children for gas chambers. This is what happens to people who beat prisoners with whips. You hang, in public, in front of thousands, slowly, painfully, and your body becomes medical waste. What other stories from history should we tell? How do we honor the victims who never got justice? Let us know in the comments and subscribe because these stories matter. The 30 people Elisabeth Becker selected matter. The children she beat matter. The women she traumatized matter. Every victim of Stutthof matters. We tell these stories not to glorify violence or revenge, but to remember, to bear witness, to ensure that never again means something. Because the truth is that Elisabeth Becker hanged on July 4, 1946. She struggled at the end of a rope while thousands watched. Her body was cut up by medical students and thrown away. She was 22 years old. She'd worked at Stutthof for 4 months, and she selected at least 30 people for death. That's the truth. The brutal, unvarnished truth about who Elisabeth Becker was and what she did and how she died. If we forget that, if we sanitize the Holocaust, if we pretend that perpetrators were all high-ranking Nazis and that low-level guards were just victims of circumstance, then we dishonor every victim. Elisabeth Becker deserves to be remembered for exactly what she was: a war criminal, a murderer, a woman who pointed at children and sent them to gas chambers, and a woman who hanged publicly for her crimes. That has to mean something.